In the previous episodes I detailed some of the struggles I had when I was trying to get over the loss of my mom and the various emotions I experienced during and since that time. And as time's gone on, I've realized that part of my issue was I was living in a world where every day felt like the last. And when I say that, I don't mean like Groundhog Day, the movie, if you've seen that movie, great movie, by the way, where it's a complete repetition of day's events, but rather the routine became so normal and so ingrained that I was getting up each day, going through each motion because it was the routine and not because I was driven with a passion for it. It became really easy to lose myself daily, forget who I was and what I wanted, and I'd lost that connection with 20-year-old me who had had the world before him and the possibilities had seemed endless. This all became evidenced in certain behaviors as that I was aware of, but I didn't know how to break. I actually felt like I was neither happy or sad, and I didn't have those highs and lows, and I wasn't apathetic as I worked extremely hard and still got satisfaction out of my work, but I had such a strong routine that it eventually surpassed my ability to break it. And I wasn't fully aware of it. So the example that became very stark was when my third child came along. It was such a happy time because we had waited to find out what the gender was. And so that was a huge surprise. And when my child was born that very day, I realized I have a son. And my better half and I had, not thought that was possible because I was pretty sure the world enjoyed that I was a girl dad and thought that was hilarious. And so I'd never expected that, and started my family a bit later in life with a younger partner, and in many ways, had never even really thought I would ever have one child. And certainly, my first two kids changed me drastically, and I used to poo poo my sister when she said it would change me for the better. Because I was sure, even though I'd never walked that road, I knew all the twists and turns of that road. But once my third child was born, we had moved and I had moved up in work roles, and the routine had become even more ingrained and had started to feel, or at least looking back now, it was very much driving the ship and directing, it was creating the directions. So what I began to notice was when I would sit down with my boy, I would engage with him for a very short period of time and my mind would wander back to work, or I would check my emails. And I began to notice it was almost involuntary. The phone was in my hand in minutes, like just so quickly, and it would almost appear there. And despite what was going on around me and what was going on in my brain, and after so many years of working, I had forgotten how to turn that need for external stimuli off and how not to respond to external things and drive what I wanted. And then I began to feel guilty because I knew there was something wrong, but the shackles of that 20-year routine had effectively grown around me, much like how a tree grows around an obstacle, but in doing so, that obstacle becomes a part of the tree. They're one and the same. I'd effectively become trapped in a prison of my routine and normalcy that I'd forgotten how to live, how to feel, and how to appreciate life. My self worth had become intrinsic to my job. The routine was so ingrained and had such a small amount of change in it in terms of my work life that I was starting to realize, my job ran me and I wasn't running my job. And don't get me wrong, that's separate from your day to day work that you do. And I was successful. I was able to get promoted several times. I enjoyed my work. I worked with great people. But the stability and that external force driving me created a situation where that stability was handcuffing me more and more and locking me down more and more. And I wasn't able to see it. And then that all shifted drastically when my mother passed because she had been a pillar in my life. And I knew that one day she would be gone. And I thought I was prepared for it, but I wasn't. And then the security of my home was threatened. People nearby lost their homes due to wildfire. Um, in the last few years, it's just been a horrific situation for so many people who have lost so much and everything they own and all their memories. And there's been hurricanes and fires and floods, and it is absolutely heartbreaking. And so that sense of security at home that I had been broken, and I didn't feel fully safe anymore at home. And Then a few months later, my work life changed drastically when our company switched hands and the culture and the norms that I was used to were no longer there. I began to realize that things had been so stable for so long that I'd forgotten how much change can and does exist in the world because I wasn't experiencing it myself or creating situations to feel that. I began to think I was immune from change, and with that routine driving me so much, I was almost lost in a daze. I wasn't driving the bus anymore. Work seeped into every aspect of my life. On vacation, I was checking for emails. At home, I was trying to get more done in the evenings, and I was losing some of those things that had defined me in my younger years, like my love of exercise. I was spending hours and hours in front of a computer or in a vehicle, and I was skipping dinner with my family to get that one more project done. My wife would come down, and I would say to her, I don't have time right now, as I need to get this done. And I'd always thought of stability as a gift, not realizing that it also has its share of consequences, some of which were very detrimental to other parts of my life. And so think of it this way. If you were to go back to 17-year-old you and ask them who they were, what would the answer have been? If you were to go back to 30-year-old you and ask them the same question, what would that answer have been? 35? 40-year-old you? 45? Now, obviously, life changes as we get older, and we tend to feel physically older, but at a certain point, I think our personalities become fairly established. And I don't know about you, but my body is breaking down faster than my brain. For instance, I'd love to still do some of the extreme sports I did when I was younger, and I still have the mental capacity for it, but the body can't take the injuries anymore. They begin to pile up, the recovery times increase drastically, and in some cases, those injuries that you used to be able to get over become nagging and not just temporary. But what I had realized was when I was younger, the world had felt very full of possibilities and unknowns. And as routine took over, those possibilities narrowed and they were becoming thinner and thinner, and not necessarily through any reality, but through that consistency of that routine. I wasn't doing new things to go do them for fun. If I did them, it was because I felt I had to do it because that's what you do, not because I was actually doing it for the fun. And this is where work seeped in because even when I was doing those things, I was still checking emails. And this is what had seeped into my time with my son. I was doing it because I felt I had to spend that time with him, almost like a job. I was one of my jobs was being a dad, and it wasn't because I was doing it to look into his eyes and to be present with him and to be his dad. And then once all that stability had been removed, I was left asking myself who I was again. So much of this became clear, but the length of routine and stability had created so much inertia that I didn't know how to break it. There was so much momentum there that it honestly, it's like walking out in front of a vehicle, a semi truck doing 120. Just I was going to get mowed over by it. But now with my mom gone, my sense of security uprooted, and my work life changing, I realized I had a tremendous imbalance in my life. My definitions of myself had become muddy, hard to grasp, and ultimately it was getting hard to define myself, even to myself. I dealt with a lot of change professionally, but not personally. And while change management was relatively easy at work, confusingly, it was very, very difficult at home and personally. And at some level, I was aware of that, but like a lot of people, the routine was comfortable and had become so ingrained over a couple of decades that I began to struggle with it. I wasn't taking care of myself physically, despite being in good shape for many years and, my 20s and 30s. I wasn't eating or drinking the proper things. I was consuming too much alcohol, and by no means an alcoholic, but just too much, and just generally getting through each day. And on some level, I began to feel like I was only responding to things and not actively changing anything. And that had its own emotional toll to a degree as you start to question yourself as well. Am I as tough as I thought I was if I couldn't change it? And self doubt creeps in. And I didn't really notice it because the constants were so powerful. But now I was at a point where what was I going to do? All the recent changes had completely uprooted my life, and it felt like I was back to square one. At times, my brain was stuck asking, why is the routine disappearing now? Do I beat myself up for not seeing it sooner? I thought I was smart. How could I not have seen it? So I began to ask those questions. And now that things are so different, who am I? What is important to me now? And with the time that I've got left that's been granted to me, what do I want for that future? And fear creeps in, and existential dread, and financial worries, and regrets over things in the past. It gets a bit overwhelming, and it contributes to and starts to create a spiraling effect that starts to become hard to control. However, one lesson I always took away from work is that when I was always faced with a new project or something new to do that, becomes very challenging, and I would worry about it, the only way to actually feel better about it was to start working on it, which is, okay, well, what's the first thing I need to do? And I don't mean that in the easy sense. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to even know where to start. But I just started eventually chronologically with small things, It was way too much to take on as a whole. So I just tried to make it to the top of each little hill each day, keep moving and try to feel those little wins. So after a year of my mom being gone and effectively ignoring it emotionally, which I had to admit to myself, I went back to the photo albums, saw her 20 years ago. And while the pain of the loss was still there, I was able to have very happy memories in it too. And the moments in time that we were able to spend together that were special started seeping in and would bring a smile. The time we would spend at our cabin, her driving me to school, the neighborhood Halloween parties, and things that started, that we did started coming back. And while I still felt that, the pang of that loss, that those times were gone, I began to better appreciate how special they were to me. And so eventually I wrote her a letter and let her know that while she and I had some difficult times in our relationship, I was so thankful for all the good times and how much I genuinely loved her. I started working out bit by bit and jogging again and starting slowly. I didn't want to cause an injury that would further hamper progress, but I slowly made progress on that front every day, one foot in front of the other. And bit by bit, as I felt better, the runs became a routine. They became part of my stress and anxiety relief to the point where it didn't feel like I could start my day unless I had been out for my jog. I didn't listen to anything, but just ran through the trees, listening to the wind alone with my thoughts, trying to just get a little bit further each day and without causing a nagging injury. I was doing push ups and sit ups, and they became easier, and I began to feel better as things that used to tire me out weren't doing it as much anymore. And I mean, I still get tired because I'm getting older, and it certainly wasn't the boundless energy of my youth or that my kids have, but I was starting to keep up with them a bit better. And I was now turning that routine that had negative consequences into a routine that had positive consequences. And I started disconnecting from media and social inputs and replacing it with family time. I made dinner with my family a priority and dropped what I was doing when dinner was ready. We would go on walks together as a family. I would shut off my phone completely, just like the good old days when no one had a cell phone and, I was no longer pinged by constant notifications vying for my attention that ultimately weren't as important as my family time. Again, changing that routine from always ignoring dinner as less important to a routine of it being incredibly important to me as a person. And I started spending time with my son and trying to be present for him and realizing that on my deathbed, he was never going to say to me how glad he was that I had worked that extra hour of overtime 16 years ago. Am I there yet? No, I'm not. But now that I've broken some of those shackles of that routine, I can see now that routine's not necessarily a negative. It's what the routine is. And I realize very much now that it needs to be a constant work in progress. And I can't let those routines with negative consequences fester. And I have to build those positive ones. So the power, as they say, can be used for good or evil. Life has an interesting way of taking over sometimes, and only through that adverse change are we really able to see it, and then sometimes change those outcomes, and then that becomes part of that journey as well. With things changing so rapidly these days, and so many people going through difficult times, it becomes so critical to be good to yourself and those around you and allow yourself to be human. Humans were never perfect, and we never will be, but we can work bit by bit to make our things better, and change that momentum, and change the way the inertia is working, to better work for us. And so now I realize that working on that may never end, but now I realize that working on it is better than the feeling like it's already ended.